Right, so yeah, I'm another one of the researchers here at Aston. This actually relates to some research I did while I was at Loughborough, but it's good to be presenting it here. I did a master's here around the time Ramesh and Mike Scott were teaching here in 2009, so it's exciting to be presenting. So this is a project that was done into interactions between young people and practitioners when they come into contact with the youth justice system. So it was a multidisciplinary team of criminologists and linguists. It was primarily a criminology project which had a sort of linguistic angle, and it was based at Loughborough and Swansea, and worked with 4 youth offending teams, who are the people who work with young people when they're arrested, etc. And so the idea was to combine the sort of criminology approach with discourse analysis to look at communication in a kind of focused way. There have been previous studies on the nature of assessment, how young people are assessed, and lots of research, some of it here, about interaction in spoken legal contexts such as courtrooms and police interviews, but there hadn't been any specific linguistic analysis of interactions between young people and practitioners, and it's an interesting context because it's full of all sort of power imbalances and all the kind of things you'd expect, but it's also a context where practitioners need to get young people to open up to kind of understand their circumstances and recommend a course of action for their case. And where this kind of interaction had been looked at in the criminology literature, it tended to be to do with language deficit, so how young people, say with specific learning difficulties, struggle to interact, but there hadn't necessarily been an examination of whether it's just what some of the challenges of the context are. So whether practitioners are doing the right things to encourage engagement, whether there are just the context, so the venue, the questions, the framework, any number of things that might influence communication in this context. And in the years sort of preceding this study, there'd been a move from an old assessment tool called Asset, which was primarily kind of a risk assessment tool, to something called Asset Plus, which tried to get a kind of broader picture of the young person's circumstances. So it was the stated aim of the project was identify and understand communicative factors that influence and impact effective engagement between young people and practitioners. So there were kind of 2 strands to the project, collecting and transcribing, so recording. Initially it was going to be video recording, but it ended up being audio recording, transcribing and analysing assessment interviews, using a sort of combination of conversation analysis, and I also, so the plan was to use conversation analysis. I also brought an element of corpus linguistics to it. And then there was a second strand, which was questionnaires, focus groups, asking young people and practitioners about their experiences of communication in this context, and bringing all of that together to form a kind of toolkit for communication. So since we were looking at young people and practitioners and where their speech does and doesn't overlap, the thing that occurred to me, having a background in corpus linguistics here, was things like n-grams and keywords would be a good place to start in looking at what's frequent about practitioner and young person language, and where are the sort of, what's a good place to start with looking at where the differences might occur. So it's quite a small data set. There were 19 interviews overall, I think 11 fully transcribed and another 8 which were partially transcribed or sort of detailed notes about the language. That's the data. So that was all transcribed, and that's what was the what was analysed in this. So I used n-grams, 3 to 6 word n-grams, looking at young people and practitioners, and then just using a simple sort of keyword analysis in AntConc, comparing young people's speech and practitioner speech to look at what's immediately different about the two data sets, essentially. And then there was another part of the analysis, which I possibly won't have time to look at today, which was looking at lexical complexity using the ANT word profiler and comparing that to BNC COCA word lists. So just to jump into the results. So yeah, probably the thing that jumps out straight away is in practitioner speech, there are a lot of question phrases and a lot of question words. It's kind of to be expected because it is an interview, but there's also a sense in which they're meant to be sort of opening. What am I trying to say here? They will be asking a lot of questions, but it's also meant to be kind of an interactive thing. It's not meant to be all, particularly since moving on from the risk assessment sort of form of this tool, it's meant to be a more open discussion about young people's circumstances and not just tick box gaining information. And it sort of, yeah, so it tells us it's a practitioner-led interaction. 94% of the questions in the assessments were asked by practitioners, and 76% of them were closed. So questions that really only require a yes or no answer rather than some kind of extended response. And this is also slightly masked by the Corpus results because a lot of the closed questions are declarative, so they don't even use question words. And there was kind of an observed effect in these interviews as well, where if people asked closed questions, they got minimal answers. If they asked more open questions, I think they were sort of twice as likely, that's right, to get something more extended. The Ngram results and the keyword results also show that practitioners are kind of summarising what the young people are saying as they go, and they're concluding and shifting the topic. So every topic in the assessments we observed was introduced and concluded by the practitioner. In over half of them, they followed the structure of the assessment. So there wasn't. So there was a fixed structure, and if a young person tried to introduce a topic outside of that structure, the practitioner sort of moved them back towards the original prescribed structure of the talk. The corpus analysis also kind of highlighted that a lot of the words that come up are risk and offence and assessment related words, which is also a potential area which could cause communication difficulties, because talking to young people and practitioners, they agreed that the offences and certain risk factors are the most difficult things to talk about. And yes, a little extract from a focus group there, where even when you sort of, yeah, so yeah, constantly criminalising, having to talk about what they've done, and quite often they'll have had to talk to the police about what they've done, the parents about what they've done, teachers about what they've done. So then revisiting the offence in these assessment interviews isn't necessarily the most constructive use of time, even though it is a thing that has to be addressed. But I'm not trying to just paint a negative picture of the assessments here. There's also evidence of practitioners using kind of hedging language to try and lessen some of that power imbalance and make themselves, yeah, from Helen's talk, seem less powerful, to kind of lessen their power in the interaction. Also, their use of personal pronouns. It could be, using we could be a kind of institutional thing where we are telling you to do such and such, but actually practitioners in the assessments I looked at were using it in a inclusive way. So they were talking about what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is start with, if we just took out nicotine and we eventually stopped in a interview section about substance issues, and sharing memories from their assessment interviews before. So do you remember when we had that conversation coming down the hill? So there's also, the corpus results point to that this is practitioner-led and it's not a very collaborative kind of communicative context, but that practitioners are also attempting to sort of build rapport in some ways with young people. And that's also evidenced by the use of affirmatives, kind of positive back channeling and stressing positives, which, talking to practitioners, they said it's a thing that's very difficult sometimes for young people to recognise in themselves. So that final quote, you sometimes need to tell them the good things because they might not see it as something positive. And there's just an example of it at the bottom there. So looking at the engrams and keywords of young people, more or less all of those results are to do with talking about the offence or reflecting on the offence and the consequences of it in some way. So again, the Corpus results point to this kind of offence focus of the interviews. The project, as I say, wasn't specifically focused on things like language learning difficulties, but one of the things that can be tricky if you have certain specific language difficulties is putting together a sort of timeline of events in that kind of way. Again, we've seen there was an offence focus, and that practitioners try to help young people see positives. There's evidence of young people sort of identifying negatives in themselves in some of the results. Sort of negative words that were all self-targeted. Probably the other notable sort of area here was mental processes, which is don't know and I can't remember, which you might expect is a kind of avoidance strategy. It's sort of a way of not answering the question. And that is certainly part of it. But it was more complicated than that. There were self-reported, for instance, not remembering things due to rage-related blackouts or alcohol consumption. Now, they could be lying about that, but it's not as simple as just trying to avoid the question. In some cases as well, there's just been a long time from when the offence took place to when they're being assessed, so it might practically just be that young people can't remember. And this was used as kind of jumping off point for looking at resistance strategies, because it's a thing that young people do quite a lot, is resisting the question in some form. But actually, so I categorised them by avoidance and refusal, which are these kind of basically trying to avoid the question. And then there's contest, which is sort of disagreeing, or correction, as it sounds. And in the data we found that actually it's more often that they're trying to actively correct the practitioner or resist some kind of thing that they're trying to put on them, rather than just refusing to answer the question. And interestingly, in terms of the practitioners trying to get them to recognise positives, a lot of the time this hedging is, in the young people speech, is either to do with in relation to that resistance thing, it's quite often qualifying positive things that the practitioners are trying to say about them. So this second example in particular, you're often the one to calm things down, sometimes, not all the time. So there's quite a lot of this, even when practitioners are trying to highlight a positive, to say, we can put this down in your, you've displayed good consequential thinking or something. I think possibly because this is a context where young people don't have much power, they seem to exert power in these ways which sometimes don't benefit them, like resisting positive evaluations of their behaviour. We're doing for time. I'll very quickly go through this. So I also looked at the language that practitioners use in Ant Word Profiler, using as a reference a study that was done of high school students in New Zealand between the ages of 13 and 18. So it's a different kind of data set, but I thought if it would set the complexity level a bit higher. I think the conclusion was that I think the figures were around 6 young people of the age of about 13, I think it was, had a vocabulary range. The lowest one in that data set was about 6,500, and the lowest 18-year-old was something like 9,500. So I use that as a basis for looking at language that's used in these assessment interviews. And the positive finding from that was 97 to 91-ish% of the language that was used was suitable for the age range. Just to look at some of the more complex lexical items that were highlighted, quite a lot of them in the kind of slightly more complex end of acceptable are to do with things that young people had to deal with in their cases. So quite often their interventions are framed in terms of things such as consequential thinking, thinking before you act, victim empathy, reparation, showing remorse, and restorative processes. And as an explanation for why young people might have acted the way they do, very frequently impulsivity or some form of that impulsiveness is discussed, but these are sort of terms that are not taken up by young people and are sort of, in comparison to this New Zealand study, are more complex than anything that appeared in the high school students' language. So, as I say, these are kind of the main areas that youth justice interventions are quite often structured around, but they are kind of concepts that young people don't seem to, it's vocabulary that young people struggle to engage with, even if the concepts themselves they can get to grips with. So here's a discussion with a young person who has been working for quite a long time with the youth vending team. Is sort of engaging with the idea that it's thinking, but consequential gets sort of missed off. Although there is a kind of sort of summary, thinking about stuff before you do it is a kind of starting to show understanding of what consequential thinking is. And here, a practitioner appears to be trying to get a young person to show that they've demonstrated victim empathy, but they just don't pick up the cue of, I'm trying to get you to recognise these are victims. So who are they? My mum, yeah. Teachers, yeah. Long pause. So they're victims, aren't they? And the asterisk means quiet. So the young person has indicated they've understood, but maybe not enthusiastically. So yeah, just to sort of conclude really, the combination of conversation analysis and corpus analysis highlighted that it's a kind of, these assessment interviews are kind of practitioner-led and they're risk and offence focused, but practitioners do try and overcome some of these sort of power imbalances and highlight positives. Young people primarily have to talk about the events of their offence and contributing risk factors, and they use hedging in a different way to kind of resist summaries and things that are said about them, possibly in a way to try and control an exchange where they don't have that much power. So just to talk about using corpus analysis in this context quickly, there were some limitations. So the size of the data set is quite small. As with any small data set, the influence of individual cases is always going to be a bit of an issue. Some of the interviews were 20 minutes. I think the longest one was the best part of 2 hours. Even in this context, we're talking about self-selecting participants. So these are young people who all in some form tried to engage with the assessment, but these are also young people who agreed to be recorded for an academic project, so they're not necessarily going to represent the most tricky cases, though I know some of them were. Also, just in terms of using the corpus analysis, this is really, this is nothing no one doesn't already know, but they are a starting point. So if you look at, for instance, I don't know, I can't remember, that might give you an impression that young people are being evasive, where that doesn't seem to have been the case. In practitioner keywords, there were quite a lot of open, quite a lot of question words that suggested open questioning, but that's probably largely because it's compared with young people who didn't really ask any questions at all. So there's kind of a flaw there. As I say, next thing, the keyword comparison, if you're just going to compare young people and practitioners, you're going to have a good idea of how their roles are distinct, but not necessarily what's frequent or notable about young people or practitioner speech in general. As I say, that analysis didn't highlight some of those things like impulsivity and consequential thinking, because they're relatively low frequency within the data set, but they are addressed in more or less every assessment. But they are a good starting point for discussing some of the issues. As I say, they offered a good way into looking at communication in this context. To some degree, the Corpus results highlighted more or less every issue that we found out about through focus groups and conversation analysis. If we'd only had the Corpus analysis, there would have been further to go with those results. Where, as it was, we kind of could cross-reference things we were finding in conversation analysis and Corpus analysis. As I say, added textual detail to some of these issues that they were aware of. When you're framing it in terms of like, these are the things that practitioners are doing frequently, these are the things that young people are doing frequently, it seemed to be understandable as a finding to present to practitioners. And I think one of the big concerns coming into this was that practitioners would feel like we were coming in to criticise them, whereas a Corpus method, the sort of unbiased nature of it, does mean you can try and promote this as a form of reflective practice and say this is what's going on. It's not coming in to show how people are doing something badly or well, it's just trying to show them what's there. So I think that's it. Yes, okay, that's all.
Thank you, Ralph. Okay, any questions in the room to begin with? Yes, Helen.
I'm just interested in that final kind of point that you made about that kind of the quantitative focus of the evidence given to the practitioners. Did you find that they responded, that there was potentially some difference in response to like qualitative kind of analysis versus the quantitative? Do you know what I mean? Does that have an implication? Was there an overt comment on that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Not really. So the thing was, by the time we presented it to practitioners, it wasn't really in a kind of linguistic form, so it was more presenting them with these are, the kinds of phrases we found, but it wasn't presented as sort of corpus analysis at all. In fact, because it was kind of a criminology project, it's taken a while to come to, I'm sort of starting to get the corpus analysis sort of a bit more organised, and it was done at the time, but it was done to kind of supplement other things, so it kind of fed into the stuff we presented to them rather than being like these are corpus results and these are conversation analysis results or something. It was the recommendations that were given to practitioners were kind of fairly broad, and then they were kind of supported with some of this stuff.
I just find it interesting how the larger data stuff can be used to be so authoritative, but also remove that kind of subjective element. That's really fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question on Zoom, and then we'll come back to the room. Khalid, would you like to rejoin us to ask your question?
Hi, I'm there.
Hello.
I've been just unmuted. Thanks so much.
It's a little bit quiet in the room.
Okay, I got one simple question for Morton. I think actually I can see how complex language problems have been actually addressed here. I mean, Morton's work might go well only in relation to description, but I don't think it goes the same way for remedy.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, these results were what I've done here is kind of shown what the corpus analysis highlighted. In terms of sort of remedy, these results were grouped together kind of thematically and relayed back to youth offending teams, and we had kind of discussions around some of these topics. So this was more the kind of highlighting of some issues, and then in terms of remedying communicative issues, there was another step which was taking this all together, and there was a toolkit, and there were kind of sessions with the practitioners. If that answers the question.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. Mike, did you have a question?
I got the impression that your data consisted of the people, the kids, being quizzed about their behaviour and their attitudes. Is that right?
Yes, a lot of
therefore
it
thinking
is that.
it might be interesting to compare that with something which was not involved in any kind of potential criminality, of a group of people being quizzed about maybe apprentice plumbers or apprentice, I don't know, mechanics building a car or whatever it might be, being quizzed by their teachers or by experts in that field, and collect another corpus so that you could try to identify something about the nature of somebody being quizzed by a high power person versus something to do with the nature of people who are having trouble with the law.
Yeah, I think that would be really useful. I think it could go in different ways. So there could be that kind of institutional thing, and I don't know, it'd be more difficult to get. But I mean, in having conversations around what's easy and difficult to talk to young people about, certainly some of the practitioners were saying I'd struggle to talk to my kids about some of this stuff, and this is a more pressured sort of environment. So there are all kinds of related data sets that would be useful. But yeah, that would be a good one in terms of like reflective practice element of it.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Okay, thanks.